All right, we're getting ready to start class now in just a couple of seconds, but I just want to I want to show you what you're missing, okay? I want to show you what you're missing. This is Seth. You all know Seth, okay? He's holding water in his mouth to see how long he can hold it. So is Gooberhead back there. Okay? So is Van. Okay? So, don't you wish you were here so you could be witness to all of that? Okay? So, all right, here we go. The good part is, once they're called out, they shape right up.
Does anyone still not watching? They still.
Does anybody even watch?
Then what are you filming?
Honestly, I would rather just
Oh,
read
it's my
it.
job. Just in
Yes,
case
I
somebody
was
decides,
watching
just in case somebody decides they want to watch this entertaining videos.
And it's fun.
Then I want
I watch your test review
they will
videos.
forever be on YouTube that no one can find because I have made it.
Man,
so-
stop.
We
Yes,
need to have
Leo.
a Mr. Beast show.
I accidentally left my history book in my house.
I accidentally left my history book at my house.
Makes work.
Okay. That's all right. Just listen and try to. All right.
We can use your Mr. Beast.
We're on page 58. Okay. We're on page 58. See, that's a great. See, when I say things like that, that's usually an indication that you should have your book out, open to page 58. Not continuing to talk to your little friend about the water they're holding in their mouth, even though they can tell you not to do that. Good. I'm looking at the. You just happen to be in my line of sight there. Yes.
So like, I get in the West, like there was like areas of just nature and woods and land and stuff, like just all country. Like now, today, which state or area is like the most like that right now?
Montana is pretty, and Wyoming
Yeah,
is
Montana.
pretty densely not densely, but isolated population. Per mile.
There's like
you
5
got parts of it, so like 5 people live
Square
per mile,
mile.
or per square mile.
It's okay.
So that's pretty isolated by today's standards.
Did they have to
Back
close
in these
down?
days, that was not uncommon at all.
Oh yeah, in Alaska.
Yeah.
Right.
But,
Did they have to close down
what?
because of coronavirus?
No, Wyoming didn't have to. Other than the city, they have like one.
South Dakota didn't close down anything either.
Yeah, you had another number. All right. How railroad turned into coronavirus is beyond me. I guess it travels by train now. It goes every other way, so apparently now it's going to start traveling by Old West trains. Okay, here we go.
That makes sense.
Hey, this makes as much sense as anything that this thing is doing.
Exactly.
Okay? It was May the 10th, 1869. Hardly a person in the whole country didn't wish to be at Promontory Point in Utah, because this is where the train tracks finally meet. Okay? They finally meet up. Okay? The people who were there listened to speeches, said a prayer, drank toast. So it was, they yelled, they cheered, 2 brass bands played. All over the country, newspapers helped the press so that they could cover the grand event. The newspaper, though, would not tell the whole story. Okay? It would take years for the real story to be known, but when Leland Sanford, representing a railroad company that had laid the tracks from the east, from Sacramento, California, over the high and dangerous Sierra Nevada mountains, onto the northern Utah, when he shook hands with Thomas Durant, who was coming the other way, coming from Omaha, Nebraska, west, okay? They shook hands, then that was when the end was there, and a telegraph operator on a high pole above the crowd sent a message, "Stand by, we have done praying." Then Sanford raised a silver hammer, okay, this big old hammer, And this is all ceremony, okay? They didn't have, not all the workers had hammers with silver ends to them. And then he was going to drive in a gold spike, the last spike, okay? He missed the first time, and he hit it the second time, okay? So he drives it in. My guess is it was not as big because the real spikes that they drove was huge. This one was more ceremonious because they had 5 of them, because all 5 of the big wigs got to take their turns driving them in. Again, ceremony. Once it was done, the workers comes out and removes the gold spikes and gives it back to them. And then they put in the real spikes to hold down the track. Okay, so you're not gonna go out west and find a, 2 foot long solid gold spike somewhere out there, okay? So that's not gonna happen.
What if somebody's so strong they just broke the gold?
No. Do what?
And what if somebody's just so strong they just broke the gold?
That's not possible. Unless they melted it.
Yeah, that would be tough.
I mean, the whole.
Okay. 5 states had sent gold and silver spikes for this historic event. So the other bigwigs got their chance to hammer away also. When they were done, the Chinese workmen quietly removed the fancy spikes and nailed in the real ones. Okay? By that time, the news had been sent to Americans' newspapers and people. Okay? Transcontinental Railroad completed, east and west linked. In Philadelphia, they rang the Liberty Bell. In Chicago, they held a parade that stretched for 7 miles. In New York, cannons blasted 100 times, because you can now go by train from New York to California. And think about it, up until this point, to travel west, remember the jump off starting point was in Missouri, and it would still take them 3 months on a wagon train to reach California.
Did they have to go?
So now they can do it in about 10 days, from New York to California.
Wait, did they ever
Why
have to
did they
like
do
clear
it
through
from
woods and stuff?
Oh, yeah, we won't talk about that. Okay? The building of that railroad had begun actually, in a way, on July the 1st, 1862. And that was the day that Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. Okay? There were visionaries, people with clear sight and imagination, who had talked even earlier of a railroad going all the way across the country. Lincoln's act got it started, but slowly. After all, we did have a civil war going on that had to end before we could worry about building a railroad across the nation, okay? But the railroad that stretched across the continent would have to wait until, of course, the Civil War was over, okay? You had 2 companies building the railroad. You had the Central Pacific, which started in the west, and the Union Pacific started in the east. And no one knew exactly where they were going to meet, because it was a race to see who could lay the most track. Because they were getting paid. If you owned, the guys that owned the company, was getting paid buku money from the government for every mile of track they laid. So they were trying to lay as much as they can. So they don't have like a certain point, we're going to stop here. So if we get here a month before you do, we're just going to stop. Nope. They kept going until they met. Okay?
Did they use?
Look at that 10
Yeah,
miles
bro.
of track in
Some
one
of the Vanderbilt, they were like probably one of the, they were like the head of one of these companies, and that's who owns the Biltmore. And yes, they were so for this. They have like 17 houses.
Oh, yeah.
That are like the size of school.
You're right. Talking about the Biltmore House. Yes.
Plus, it's not like they did a straight line because they were trying to.
Well, they actually had surveyors. It's not like they were just laying track and hoping that they met up somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually had surveyors that kept them on track. Yeah. Now that's a good question though, because you do. It never mentions anything like that. It makes it sound like they just started laying tracks in Omaha and then Sacramento, and you just kind of hope that they met up somewhere. But no, they actually they had surveyed the land. They knew where they were going. It was just sometimes not easy going the routes they had to go. Okay. All right.
What about the people that like actually did it? Did they get paid well?
No, like $1 a day.
Okay. Now, That was it. It was an important race for those who owned the railroad companies. The government was giving out subsidies for each mile of railroad track that was laid. We're talking like $1,000 a mile back in these days.
And that's like $1 million.
Okay?
And the workers got paid
And
$1.
paper got, yeah, workers got like $1 a day. Okay?
That's huge.
Okay.
Did he get like
Now,
$1,000?
hold up.
Oh,
They got $1,000 a mile.
And how many miles did they go?
Well, from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California.
Look at that, 10 miles of track laid in one day.
So,
Dang.
it took a while. So of course, if you own this thing, you want to lay a lot of track. Under the best conditions, laying track isn't easy, and conditions was rarely best. Remember, this was frontier land that they were crossing. The railroads had to bring all of their own supplies with them. If there was an emergency, there wasn't anybody to go running to for help. I mean, you're out in the middle of nowhere. Okay? You laid track by putting heavy metal rails on top of wooden cross pieces. Okay, these are trim logs that are called ties. Okay? The Union Pacific used 40 railroad cars to haul 400 tons of rails, timber, and fuel and food needed for each mile of track. Each mile of track, not the entire railroad, each mile of track. Okay?
400 tons of rail for 1 mile?
Yep. The Central Pacific bought its rails. Now this is the tough one. If you're coming from California, there's no train to get all this stuff out there yet, right? And you can't take it out there by wagon train because it weighs too much. So they bought its rails, locomotives, and supplies from the East Coast on clipper ships. And they sailed to the Cape Horn at the tip of South America and worked them up from there. Can you imagine that? Leaving like New York Harbor or somewhere and have to go down and around to South America to get your goods to start laying track. So they had quite a journey before they ever started building track. Okay? Now, laying track on flat land is not too difficult, but try crossing a mountain. You had a choice. You either go through or over. And the railroad men did a little bit of both. Okay, they dug tunnels through some mountains. They laid tracks on others, over others. And at first, the equipment they used was about as fancy as what you would probably find in your garage or in your outbuilding. Pickaxe, shovels, things of that nature. That's what they were using to
And bare
dig
hands.
tunnels and things. Bare hands. Okay, can you imagine? Can you imagine? That would be very slow.
It's kind of like
Okay? They dug tunnels with shovels, their bare hands, pickaxes. They carried stone and dirt out in wheelbarrow. Sometimes they would use explosives. Sometimes they would blow themselves up because they were not explosive experts. Okay? So, in order to build a railroad, the 19th century style, you start with graders. Okay? These are the guys, they went with picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows and wagons, and they graded the land. They're making it as level as they can. That's what, when they're talking about grading land, they're trying to make it level. When we built the athletic complex over here, that was not level ground over there.
It wasn't.
Okay, I mean, it was not like huge slopes, but it was not perfectly level. So we had to bring in a person, you had to bring in a team with bulldozers and things back now, of course, and they leveled it off. And once they got it leveled off, then like a soccer field, it's actually, they crown it from the middle down, so there's a little bit, the middle is actually a little bit higher than the edges.
Yes.
So that for drainage and stuff like that. Okay? Yes, Morgan.
I remember seeing this episode of like an older Western TV show, and it showed these two men like working on stuff like this, and one of them set off an explosive, and one of them passed away from.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and that unfortunately, that did happen. It really did.
What do they do?
All right.
They just like farewell and just will send it to the kid.
Well, they got blown up. That's pretty much it. I mean,
When you get blown up, there's not much
Been a whole lot
left.
left. Okay, so once they get it graded,
There's no point saving it.
once they get it graded now you've got the track layers that's got to come in. Okay.
Muscular chip.
And muscular. He referred to them as muscular track layers. They lifted and placed the heavy wooden ties and the heavier metal rails. And next comes the gazers, the spikers, the guys who drove the spikes in and made sure this thing was,
Wait,
Secure
there's
it down.
the metal spikes like this?
oh, they're huge. Yep. Now, each rail takes 10 spikes. And each mile takes 400 rails. So that's 4,000 spikes has to be drove
Can you
through.
imagine how bad your
per
back would
mile.
be hurting?
Now, these
You're
guys
making
are
10
swinging.
miles in a day?
And these guys are swinging, well, there's more than one of them. There's teams. These guys are swinging like 16-pound sledgehammers. Okay, that's hard enough. If you've ever used a sledgehammer, you imagine going
Yeah.
all day long. But the guy that had the guts, because they didn't take it, you know how you'll take a nail and you'll take your hammer and you'll kind of like tap, 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 tap and get it, and then you start hammering. And if you're good, you can actually nail it in without bending it. These guys, they didn't just tap, tap, tap this great big spike. You had a guy that stood there and helped that thing,
Oh gosh, no.
while the other guy hit it with
No.
a hammer.
No.
And he would hit and he would turn it, and he would hit it, and he would turn it, and somebody said, well, what if they missed? They crushed somebody's hand.
They got pretty good at hitting those
Oh,
sticks.
yeah, but I mean, this is what
But
they
that's
did.
it.
So I'm sure you had people, hands got messed up too, by doing that.
Hashtag Johnny.
Yeah. Yes,
So when we put a new fence line in for my
stop talking, please.
so when we put new fence line in for my house, we would have to like nail in the fence posts, and we would have to use this weird pipe that this like I don't know what it was. It would drive in dirt and pack it up.
Yeah, yeah.
It's real. It wasn't right, but it wasn't like.
No, it makes it a little bit easier though.
And
Yeah.
so it was my great grandpa's, and my dad kept stabbing it, and I tried it. It's so scary because it's afraid you're gonna hit your foot.
Oh, yeah.
And it's also you have to nail in the hands.
Okay. Let's not relive your whole fence building.
I'm really good at hammering up.
Okay.
I
Hold
just
up,
tap
hold
my
up,
finger
hold up,
in,
hold up, hold
and
up.
then at the last second I let go,
We
and it goes in.
got a little bit more to go, guys. Let's actually do class today. All right. Now, the Central Pacific Railroad sent ships to China. They bought 7,000 Chinese workers to California to build a railroad, just to build a railroad. Okay, that's why they bought them in. They paid them a whopping $1 a day. Okay? The Chinese worked incredibly hard for long hours and mostly were treated with contempt. In other words, they didn't like them, but they did the work. Okay? Coming the other way on the Union Pacific, most workers were either ex-Confederate soldiers, former slaves, or Irish immigrants. For what, can you imagine ex-Confederate soldiers and freedmen working together, and then you throw the Irish in, and for whatever reason, the Irish was not well liked. They were not liked as immigrants. They were kind of wanted to stay away from them.
Imagine Confederate soldiers.
So you got three groups here that really don't like each other, working on a railroad, living in these little tent towns that they set up. Now each section though had their own place. They didn't intermix. They stayed out. A lot of fights, a lot of killing. This is not a. These little towns becomes very violent. Okay,
This
cause
isn't a Utah
a
here.
lot of drinking going on, things like that at night and stuff. Okay,
A lot of members.
they worked hard, but they also at night
They partied hard.
they did other things. Okay, so. And they too worked hard. They lived in tent cities, put up, and taken down as the railroad went west. These moving towns were tough, violent places. There was too much drinking, too many guns, the constant fear of Indian raids. Of course, the Indians had been promised this land, and now, of course, we're taking it back once again. So they're not real happy about that. So they do occasionally attack the little towns that are set up. Not as often as the movies makes it out to be. Actually, it was more people probably died from diseases and accidents, the cold, the heat, things like that, than they did from actual Indian attacks.
They forget about stuff like that,
Yeah.
like the weather, the bugs, the diseases.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
they really are.
What about like Did the Native Americans, like, if I was a Native American, I just want to glue the train tracks up.
Yeah, they just didn't have the equipment to do so, or they probably would have.
Yeah,
All right.
they didn't have enough gunpowder for that.
Yep. So, some people deserve medals for what they accomplished, especially the engineers and the organizers who arranged for food and shelter, who planned the routes, who supervised the work. None of that was easy, and they did it with incredible speed, considering how they were having to do it. Now, at the railroad, after the railroad met in Utah, everyone had to wait 2 days to celebrate, and that was because Thomas Duran, the head of the Union Pacific, was late. Okay, the Union Pacific workman had changed his fancy pot. Now remember that his workers are living in tents in the mud and the slop. He has a fancy train car that he lives in that is made out with the nice beds, nice chairs.
Yeah, and they just
I mean,
slowly
it
fall.
is a very nice living condition for him. Okay, but they chained it to the tracks because he had not paid them. Okay, they had past due wages, so they would not. They chained his car to the track until he ponied up the money. Now, by that time, Duran, of course, was rich enough to make King Midas envious. So was Leyland Sanford. Sanford made his employees salute when his car went by. He made them stop and salute him because he put himself way up on a pedestal. Okay?
I was watching this
Okay.
video of Obama.
Okay.
I mean, why did they not kill him?
He paid the bills.
You just kill
Okay.
them?
I mean, it's okay.
When the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, Sanford, Durant, and other railroad tycoons were national heroes. Today, many historians, when the truth comes out, they're referred to as crooks because they were ripping people off left and right. You see, they asked for government aid in building the railroad. That was reasonable. It was too big of an undertaking for an individual. But they demanded more money from the government. They wanted and got enormous and valuable land grants. So they were getting given land as they were going out through there.
But they would sell
Okay?
most of it.
Then they would turn and sell. Okay? So taxpayers are supporting all this stuff now. When their companies gave out, and that wasn't illegal, okay? Then they sold stock in their company to private investors and made more money. That, again, that's not illegal either. You can do that. But then when they would give a contract to have work done, they would award it to themselves for a huge amount of money and then pay people a pittance to do the work. You know, most of the time when you contract out, you give that company the contract. They're the one who makes the money. But that's not, they hired themselves and then they hired other people to do the work. Okay? So that was and then they didn't pay their stockholders. Okay? Their stockholders that own stock in the company, when the company makes money, they pay what they call dividends. They didn't pay them. They just kept all the money to themselves. They took their money to help finance everything, but then they kept the profits.
They kept what
They
they
kept the profits. So that's kind of illegal. And as you know, they hardly pay their worker, and still worse, they allowed poor and unsafe workmanship because it was cheaper and it made their profits higher.
It's like not good food for working.
Yep. So that side of it was a mess, and when some of the story came out a few years later, it created a big scandal, and that was that U.S. Grant, at that time, U.S. Grant was the president, and it almost destroyed his term in office. All the fuss did, all the chaos, the fuss, did help the government to pass regulations, though, on how companies had to run at that point in time. Still, to be fair, it took great imagination and some risk to finance the railroads. The man who did had foresight and courage, even if they had no consideration for their employees, stockholders, or fellow citizens. The good part of the story is that people in the United States can now travel from coast to coast in 10 days. Okay? Some people still went west and covered wagons, but it wouldn't be long before the wagons were history. Okay? Soon, there were several transcontinental railroads. They were hauling things as well as people. So railroads kind of made the United States into a united country. People from different parts of the nation got to know each other. New immigrants could go west and settle. People on the west coast could come east. People on the east coast could go west. So you know, it made the country seem a little bit smaller.
And civilized.
Yeah, instead of being so far, so wide, and so distant, and all of that. So that was pretty cool. Okay. Hope you enjoyed it.